Shiki, I'm gonna ask you because I just joined. Who was talking, bro? Okay, since Shiki wants to be retarded. Okay, probably Archie. Okay, don't hate me, Apollo. That's what Shiki said. All right, go ahead, Archie.
Thank you. So now that the recording's back on, now that we've saved the previous one after he was being disingenuous and over talking to get away from the question.
Muted. Oh shit! This is the end of time.
Excuse me.
Oh my God! All right, bro, chill, bro.
Trash.
Like you're a grown man who can't have a normal
I look. If he's just gonna keep on, I ain't gonna wait. Hold on, let me
embarrassing.
get this nigga straight, bro. If he's gonna keep on like,
Yeah, I was gonna say we're gonna have to. He doesn't want to have a debate. He's just running. I don't know why. But
I'm fine
I'll
to
ask my question while he's. Oh wow, I can't even do that. I can't even ask a question while this man baby's in here. I'll just ask my question while he's muted. Now, you mentioned about how there's a distinction.
Why am I getting
how when
you?
it's talking about propositions?
There's moderation. Moderation is something that's established in the format. But go ahead, Archie.
Thank you. So you're talking about. You said you're referencing propositions and when you're not. I've addressed this directly, and somehow you keep circling back on this as if you're autistic, right? If that's the case, then can you tell me this? Is the proposition, okay, this proposition right here, this particle exists before measurement. Is this true or false when quantized to any level? Tell me.
So is he going to get muted?
Yup, if he overtalks you, yup.
Okay, got you. So just to respond to the question, right? The question does not address the argument whether or not one is able to quantize the thing you're talking about has no sort of relevancy or pertinence to the point being made here, because what I was establishing, to which you have agreed with, but I'll just repeat the agreement you've made to refresh your small pea-sized brain which has short-term memory loss. I told you, okay, I've emphasized on this point too. I told you that quantum mechanics, which is about particles primarily, it's about the smallest particles in the universe, right? The reference of the field of study, which is quantum mechanics, is different from the reference of the LEM in the context of classical logic. Then I also told you at the same time that what you're talking about depends on the interpretations of quantum mechanics and how it handles this. And what you're referencing, by the way, to which you did not know the name for, because again, you are a dumb fuck who is a wannabe smartass who has never actually done the necessary research to actually understand the concepts you employ in this conversation. But you're referencing here is the Copenhagen interpretation. And the Copenhagen interpretation does not point out any incompatibility given the facts we know about in quantum mechanics and the indeterministic probabilistic properties of certain particles and the law of excluded middle. All it points out is that before measurement, it is the case that there's no definite answer regarding the properties of a particular property. Just because there's no definite answer does not mean there's no fact of the matter. Because what it means to say there's no definite answer about a given thing is not that there's no fact of the matter regarding that given thing, but rather it's saying that indexed to our epistemology, which, by the way, to break down this term for you, I just talked about knowledge, indexed to what we currently know, it is the case we don't have any means of certainly, conclusively demonstrating or proving what the properties of a given thing actually is. And so upon measurement, then we would actually have a definite truth value or property we can assign to a given particle. So that's what I'm talking about there, which I just described the Copenhagen interpretation for you. You should be paying me for these classes, by the way, but irrespective of that, that is different from the law of excluded middle, where you're making the claim not about epistemic theses and the indeterminacy, the epistemic indeterminacy of determining certain given properties, but rather it's talking about the metaphysical nature of propositions in a binary logic system. These are two different things. And so for you to think that quantum mechanics, these specific fields of studies and these facts and interpretations in quantum mechanics, which by the way is questionable, is incompatible, debunks my position, it's laughable, it's comical, it just points out that you're critically misinformed and you don't know what you're talking about, Archie. Can you hear me now?
Damn, man.
Okay, so now that you're done repeating yourself, I'm not exactly sure what your response was for. I mean, if we were to break down your response and summarize it, if we were to get past all of the weird, like, broken English and just Jamaican jargon, right? We understand that you just told us that quantum mechanics studies things that are very small. The logic framework that the LEM falls under, you told me that this doesn't refer to this. No, this refers to something distinct. This refers to the propositional nature of things. Okay, that's cool. So 2 responses before then, I already agreed that this is the case and explained why this doesn't matter to me. Okay, so now that we understand I've already addressed everything you just said, I'm going to repeat the addressment, but in a short-timed manner, just to demonstrate that that's all you could have done, right? Now, the idea is, it can be the case that it refers to, I guess, the propositional nature of things, if that's what you're trying to say. I could barely understand you, honestly. But the idea is, even if that's the case, I believe that the proposition, whether this particle exists or doesn't exist, is both true and false. So this is still something that affects propositions regardless, right? I think this is both true and false, and I think this can be demonstrated by the fact, okay, that in response to reality, okay, it would be inaccurate and false in correspondence to reality to say that it doesn't exist. It'd be inaccurate and false in correspondence to reality to say that it does exist. Okay, I believe they're at a simultaneous state of existence and non-existence. This is something that's trivial, Apollo. Okay, this is something that I think as eighth grader that's taken a STEM class could explain to you. We all know what superposition is. Okay, we all know this. We all know about the double slit experiment. This is something that I broke down in the beginnings just so you didn't have to repeat and ramble on, Apollo. Okay, listen, the insults, all this, you haven't responded to the argument. The reason why you can't answer that question is because you know the minute you answer, there's going to be a bunch of people on recording that just saw you admit that superposition is actually not a superposition, which in reality, that's not the case. You're just referring to something completely different entirely. Why? Because you can't address the actual question. And by the way, for reference, excitations, okay, with virtual particles that leads to real particles. And we're talking about the energy transfer between these fields and bosons acting as the middleman, which is what I was describing by field transfer earlier. We're talking about quantum field theory. We're not talking about quantum mechanics, you tard member. Do you understand this? These are completely distinct things. Not completely distinct, but very, very distinct. Okay, quantum field theory makes it for things that mechanics can't alone. That is trivial. So I want you to respond to my argument. If you don't respond this time, I'm fine with just us getting a judge afterwards, because this is embarrassing. You didn't respond to anything. You just repeated yourself, stated the conclusion you believe in, and said, okay, that's it. We know your conclusion. We heard you a million times. Respond to the argument and stop wasting people's times, you fucking retard.
So he complains about the insults and so on, trying to make himself seem as if he's a good faith debater. And then he proceeds with the insults, which he's not even good at, by the way. It's not even as creative as I am. But, let's get on to what's being talked about there. He talks about the idea of probably just repeating what he's saying, which, if I really am just repeating what, you're saying, then you'd have to be agreeing to the conclusion of what I'm saying, right? Because what I'm talking about there, which you think is a repetition of what you're saying, is just merely pointing out the radical distinction between what quantum mechanics is talking about and the examples and the instances you're referencing regarding the uncertainty of determining certain properties in certain particles and the truth value, or rather what the LEM is attempting to convey when they're talking about the binary nature of propositions and whether propositions are either true or false, right? So if you're going to say that I'm just merely regurgitating your point, I'm just merely repeating your points, and you classify that to be repetition, then in other words, you agree with my point. You agree that there is a distinction, and your point and your response, it is a non sequitur. You have not in any way corrected any of the points I've made. In fact, all he just said was he just gave a long-winded explanation and regurgitation of what I said, which you just learned, by the way. Never knew about this stuff before I actually mentioned and explicated on this concept. But irrespective of such, it seems as if I have to just repeat myself again, right? Because you're just not understanding that what the LEM is talking about is not specifically about our ability, our epistemic ability or faculties to determine certain given things regarding the smallest particles, right? Like in the case of superposition, right? What he's talking about is something which is more important, right, than just the epistemic faculties of determining the truth value of certain propositions. It's talking about the nature of the propositions, right, which is different. So the difference is that you're making a conflation between epistemology and how we use this as a tool and equipment to determine facts upon measurement in the context of quantum mechanics, and you actually having such given things which determine the nature of propositions, i.e. the binary truth value system, okay? And so a lot of logicians who agree with me. They're tiny logicians who actually reconciles quantum mechanics with classical logic. This is not like a big deal. I'm not doing something which is a revolution to logic or quantum mechanics, son. This is something which people have done before. Your refutation is trash. This is why I told you that the arguments you've given is dog piece and is really disappointing because, again, anyone with an IQ of 25 can clearly string up an argument as to why it would be the case that this argument you're given here is a non-rebuttal, it's a non-point, it's a non-critique, it's trash polemic. Now, the superposition thing you're talking about, superposition describes potentialities, okay? It doesn't describe what the actual fact of the matter actually is. And so if you're going to reference superposition, by the way, as a means of going against any of the principles of logic, again, that would be a non-point because what these things you're talking about are potentialities. They're not talking about what the fact of the matter is in the actual world, but the potentialities of what the fact could be. Okay, so different things. Again, I wish that BC could actually relate to some of this, but it depends on who actually is educated to these concepts, which clearly you, Archie, is not educated on. But with that being said, we can just go back to the meat and potatoes, which you've been crawling away from, which is the first proposition about the mind-dependent nature or the mind-independent nature of a given thing, right? Which, by the way, has nothing to do with the determination of physical properties, which is what you're talking about. So I hope we can actually string an argument or a response which could actually tie it back to the relevant course of the conversation instead of you doing this indefinite schizo-rambling session where you think for some reason that putting together big words that you can't even spell properly is a good rebuttal, okay? That's just a pro tip from a better debater. So take my advice. Okay, give a response.
Well, I would take your advice, but seemingly you can't even follow it yourself if you've been caught multiple times talking to underage children and femboys. Okay, so I'm not going to take the advice of a pedophile who's sexually confused. Rather, I'll just educate this poor little guy to make his existence a little bit better on what quantum mechanics actually is, you fucking Nimrod. Now, the idea is, okay, when we get to below atom size, the rules of existence change. This is something that I think I could describe to someone below the age of 5. Okay, if we take a look at subatomic levels of existence, okay, you're gonna notice it gets a lot harder to measure. Okay, do you know why it gets a lot harder to measure? Don't answer that. I don't want to hear your answer. I'm gonna be disgusted. The reason why it gets hard to measure is because we start noticing they're not like literal physical properties that we can touch. Okay, they're not physical properties we can touch. They're clouds. What kind of clouds are they when you get to things like particles, virtual particles? They're probabilistic clouds, Apollo. That is what you're describing. You're describing probabilistic clouds. Now, this is something that you shouldn't have to re-explain. You should know that you actually already explained this accidentally when you described what a wave function is earlier, but you don't know about that. So I'm gonna excuse that. And instead, I'm gonna explain why you're just wrong. Okay? The idea is when we talk about all kinds of different potentialities of what could happen. This is what I was referencing, you tard member. Do you understand that? That's what I was referencing. Okay, I'm gonna explain something to you. I'm gonna give the example of light refraction to you. Okay, now when light reflects, let's say you're in a body of water, you're floating under the water, and you're looking at an image that's above you. Okay, let's say someone shines a light beam at you or something at you. You're not going to see exactly where that person is. You're not, right? You're going to see what the light is reflecting you as. Okay. Now this can be explained using many different equations, but I'm not going to yap your ear off, right? I'm just going to explain the simplistic bits to you. The idea is when light has to transfer, okay, through a certain a vacuum paradigm, whatever, okay, a certain field, okay, it's going to go through every exact possibility and every single instance to where it could possibly be located until it hits that final event to where it interacts and observes something. Okay? Now, this observation can be described in many ways. We're not thinking of just human observation, Apollo. We're thinking about any time it interacts with something. This can be described not just by light, but also what I was referencing earlier, including particles. Apollo. Now, these probabilistic clouds and these particles, these are not things that we know. The grand idea of this that is weird, okay, Apollo, is that no matter what color box we put it in, there's going to be a property that is completely unchanging. And it's not because we've just built wrong boxes, right? Because as I mentioned earlier, we've tested on multiple things and I've sent multiple citations for it. But the idea is that there is just a fundamentally unchanging property of it. Now, if it is the case that there's a fundamentally unchanging property of it, cool, we know that physically it can't do this. Now, how does this relate to logic? Okay, well, Apollo, I asked you initially whether this applies to every context and whether this applies to every event. Might I remind you? Okay. So if it's the case that I ask this for every event, okay, how does the law of excluded middle, that things can either be this or that, not this and that, apply to every event? So I gave you an example of this event because you said it applies to every event. And I asked you, how does this apply to the event of superposition, to where things are simultaneously not and is, right? They are happening and not happening. I gave you multiple examples of this happening. So we know this phenomenon exists. You already admitted to the existence of wave functions. So you know the probabilistic waves, right? For the clouds. So I want to know, Apollo, and I just want you to answer this and not run from it, okay? The proposition, this particle exists before observation, okay? Is this proposition true or not true, okay? And if you were going to say that it is true, okay, you're going to say that it is true that this exists. I'm going to tell you you're wrong, because obviously we understand from examining, right, especially with the double slit experiment with photons, that they do not actually have a point of position. And if you're going to tell me that they also at the same time do not exist, right, if you're going to tell me that proposition is false, then I'm going to tell you, Apollo, that that's not the case, right? I'm going to tell you that they do exist in some weird way, but also not at the same time. And we understand that they do exist in some weird way while not at the same time because of the probabilistic effects that we see, because the observational effects that we see of different waves when we get down to such a level, because they have consequences. So we know something's there, okay? So go ahead and answer that question, Apollo. And while you attempt to ramble and dance around this and say that this question is irrelevant, even though if it was irrelevant, why can't you just simply answer? We're going to see how many insults and how many attempts and jabs you throw to try to get at the fact that you're running from this. Try to get out the fact that it's not an incomplete set of knowledge. That's the issue. Try to get out the fact that it's not that we're referring to two different things. It's the fact that you can't actually address my argument because you don't know a flipping thing about quantum mechanics. You don't know a flipping thing about quantum field theory. And quite frankly, as to what I'm concerned by, I think you're attempting to get out of this by using logic that still applies to quantum field theory that you just didn't know because of your miseducation on it. So go ahead and respond, Apollo, right? And try to wrap up the insults within 5 minutes, okay?
Okay, son. Cool. So back to what I was saying. So, you know, it's funny. I don't know if you remember who you're actually talking to, but it's actually Paul you're talking to, the same guy who educated in quantum Darwinism recently, dumb retard. When I asked you what is quantum Darwinism, you said you don't even know the concept. Quantum Darwinism, by the way, as I explicated on in the chat, which you didn't even know on, or know about, I should say, what is a reconciliation between the objective rules of classical mechanics and quantum mechanics, the probabilistic rules of that. I told you about it. You never even knew what quantum Darwinism is. So for it to look at me right now and say with a confident tone that I don't know but quantum mechanics, when I educated you in chat when you expressed ignorance in the topic, which is a basic fundamental concept in quantum mechanics, is ridiculous. Now you're going to talk about and complain about jabs and insults. You made these preemptive responses like, oh, I hope you wrap up the jabs and insults in 5 minutes. It's funny because you proceeded in the previous response, because you had no actual creative rhetorical jabs. The last resort you had was to appeal to fallacious, debunked accusations regarding the femboy stuff and the pedophilic stuff to actually make yourself seem dominant. Because again, that's really what you can do, really. The only attempt or the only means you can even come off as persuasive, and by the way, the only persons you're persuasive to are biased low IQ goons, is by making personal attacks. Because that's really just all it boils down to on your end. Now, to talk about the quantum mechanics stuff, you explicitly stated, by the way, okay, while you're talking, and I even typed out the comments you've made and quoted you, you said that you were referencing potentialities, okay? Which is true. I quite literally interpreted your own argument for you, which you weren't even aware of. Then you agreed with my interpretation, then acted as if I was the imbecile. Yes, you were talking about potentialities. I've explicated this how you're just merely talking about potentialities in the context of quantum superposition, by the way, and probabilistic wave functions. And then you proceeded to agree and confirm that you were in fact talking about this. So where does this lead us to? Where does Arch's concession towards him agreeing that, you know, he's talking about, you know, potentialities, where does this actually lead us to? What it leads us to is demonstrating that the response you're giving, which is predicated on these potentiality type responses, right, would be a non-critique, it would be a non-point. It would not be a proper, effective rejoinder to my position. Because guess what, retard? And I hope you're listening, retard, like a fucking dipshit. Guess what? The law of excluded middle It's not talking about potentialities, but truths, facts, that which is an actuality. And so if you agree that the point you're making is not a description about two things, or one thing being in a state determinately of up and down in the context of superposition, then you would have to agree that it would not be a violation of the law of the middle or the law of non-contradiction, right? Because guess what? These things are talking about not just mere potentialities, but what is in fact true. Again, you reference these quantum physicists, which I know for a fact you've never read any papers on these guys or anything like Sean Carroll or any of these people, but any actual physicist would completely laugh at your point, right? They would actually mock you if they were to actually hear this embarrassing blunder and interpretation on your end regarding the principles of quantum mechanics and how it actually supposedly violate classical logic, because it doesn't. Okay, so again, right, when you're talking about LEM, LEM is talking about propositions, not about pre-measurement reality. It's not talking about what happens before measurement of certain things, right? What quantum mechanics is talking about, on the other hand, is the pre-measurement reality. And so that's what makes it the case that you're just talking past the principle, the classical logic principle I'm employing here. You're not actually addressing the principle. You're using an entirely different field, which talks about something entirely different, and think for some reason this attacks my point sufficiently when it does not. So just to wrap things up really, because there's really nothing else to add, because I'm just repeating myself because he's repeatedly not tracking. Okay, the point you're making is not talking about the thing that you should be talking about, which is specifically about truth value gaps. It's talking about potentialities. Okay, so the state of superposition is a weighted set of possibilities for future measurements. It's not specifically talking about, right, a violation of binary truth. It's talking about, and it reflects our knowledge, right? When you measure, you get a classical outcome. There's no middle ground. There's no violation of classical logic principles. And this is called the Copenhagen interpretation. It resolves ambiguity, right? So even other interpretations like the many worlds interpretations and even the Neo-Copenhagen interpretation, right? These things resolve this specific thing that you're talking about, right? There's no quantum mechanics interpretation, and I'm pretty certain there's no like the consensus amongst quantum physicists is not that quantum mechanics debunks the law of the square in the middle. This has been resolved by logic experts. Like, it's not just me who's saying this, like the experts are saying this, right? This has been resolved by these experts, right? So your argument is trash, as I've said previously. Even me, who's not even an expert on this field, who knows a lot more about you on this thing that you've been studying for the past couple of months, by the way, is able to understand and explain it fully as to how it is the case that none of the points you're making actually debunks the LEM. So if you want to give your last of the trash response, you can go for it. If you have
Okay,
already
gotcha. So obviously you don't actually understand
yeah, go
exactly
for it.
what you're referencing. Okay, so the Copenhagen interpretation, which I actually already referenced earlier, but you were too retarded to understand. I mentioned Niels Bohr. I literally said that there are counter interpretations to this position in this theory. Okay, I mean, if we even get into the origins of quantum physics to begin with, it was literally made to clown it because it seemingly didn't make sense to us at the moment. Okay, but we understand superposition does exist. Okay, we understand that this is a phenomenon that does happen. We understand that there is, in fact, we know for certain that we are uncertain about this probabilistic event. The only thing the Copenhagen interpretation even gives us or suggests is that these particles exist in such superposition states until they collapse into one point, one specific dot of an event that we observe. If you don't believe me, which you probably actually, I hope you don't believe me, because honestly, I'm starting to think that you're just retarded. Okay, the idea is right here. Okay, this is the interpretation. If you don't believe me, you can go look it up yourself. You can go look and look. I'll even read with you. I'll go down. Look. Origin and the use of turn. Listen. Let's actually no. Let's go to the nature of the wave function. Look, I'll read it for you. The Born, watch this. The Born rule is essential to Copenhagen interpretation. Okay, it was formulated by Max Born. Look, the guy you referenced, right, in 1926. Okay, it gives the probability that a measurement of quantum system will yield a given result. In its simplest form, it states that the probability density of finding the particle at a given point when measured is proportional to the square of the magnitude of the particle's wave function at that point. Wow. So that's referring to distance. That's saying that when we measure it, we can point to a specific distance. Apollo, hey, Apollo, hold on. Just in case you think that I'm misrepresenting this, right? Just in case you think that that this is something that's silly that I'm just mentioning. Here, hold on. We're going to educate the VC on quantum mechanics for a second, okay? Look in chat. Look in chat. Okay? Do you understand this, right? You understand this, right? So this is going over, Apollo. This isn't going over where they come from, how they're annihilated. This isn't even explaining half of the nature of them, Apollo. This is telling us is that when we measure them, we see them. Congratulations, you understand basic high school quantum mechanics. Now, as I'm mentioning to you, obviously, we understand this. This is trivial. This is something every quantum physicist is going to agree to. Okay, if they've read a lick of literature, Apollo. That's how I know you haven't read. You just agreed to me, you Tard member. That's an issue. That's a huge issue. The idea is, if we understand, yes, Apollo, the people who are sobbing, they're just schizophrenic. They don't exist. I agree. But the idea is, okay, if we were to say that this event was existing while not existing, okay, that is a proposition. That's a proposition, right? Now, whether that proposition is true or false, we can describe potentially as true that this is a simultaneous event. Okay, but when we ask whether it is just existing or whether it is just not existing, okay, we could ascribe it potentially even to a statement of false. It's not just doing this. Okay, this is true, but when we get to the actual quantum phenomenon of these fields appearing, well, before measurement, if we were to say, okay, is it true that this is alive and dead? At that point, we can no longer answer. At that point, we can no longer answer because we can't see past the probability cloud. Okay? This is something that is natural, and this is something that I already have proven by giving the definition of what a wave function even is. I put this in chat for you, Paulo. You didn't even read what I sent. That's embarrassing. Okay? Now, am I down to wrap this up? No. Now, the idea is, if it is the case, Apollo, to where, it's just referring to these propositional values and that you simply think that this is the case, I understand your conclusion, but I wanted evidence in favor of that. You didn't actually give evidence in favor of that. You didn't give anything. You attempted to give a misrepresentation of what quantum mechanics was. You tried to lie and deceive these people in VC into believing that we can actually measure these events before observation, which is not the case. And then you attempted